Okay, good morning, everybody. This is the men's Sunday school. This is the men's Sunday school class from Mercy Baptist Church. Easy for me to say. All right. My name's Robert Rathbone, and we're going to be in Mark chapter 9, focusing on verses 17 through 29. And this book, or this lesson, we're going to learn a little bit about faith, and hopefully I will not misrepresent faith. I'll be able to do it accurately. But in this passage here that we're going to be focusing on, Jesus is presented with a case of a young man who's been possessed by an evil spirit, and his disciples actually got first shot at trying to cast this evil spirit out, but they weren't able to. So when Jesus starts dealing with it, he points out the lack of faith that's at work in this situation. As we're going to see, it's just across the board. And just, not only the father who brought the son who's possessed by the evil spirit, not only is he dealing with a lack of faith, but also the disciples and even Israel as a whole. But this father who brought his son to Jesus, he recognizes his own doubts, and he asks Jesus. He does what really all of us should do, is he says, "Lord, help thou mine unbelief." So we'll get into that as we progress through the lesson. So before we get started, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, I want to thank you again for your love, your mercy, and grace. Thank you for dying on the cross for our sins. And I ask you, Father, that you would teach us, Lord, about faith. Help us to see from your word here what Jesus said, and that you would help us to have a better understanding of faith, Father. So all these things we ask in the precious name of Jesus Christ. Amen. All right. Since our book has a start in verse 17, let me try to briefly summarize the first 16 verses, and that actually sets the context for our focus verses. Starting verse 1, Jesus takes Peter, James, and John, basically his inner circle, up to a secluded place on a high mountain, and he's transfigured in front of them. Elijah and Moses appear as well, and they talk with Jesus. Peter, in typical Peter style, doesn't know what to say, and so he says, "Lord, we ought to build 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Elijah, and one for Moses." But he's interrupted by the voice of God the Father, who's speaking from a cloud that envelops them. And of course, they cower in fear. The voice of God says, "This is my beloved Son, hear ye him." Then suddenly, when they open their eyes, everything's back to normal, and all they see is Jesus. Then they're coming down from the mountain, I guess because they just saw Elijah and it's fresh on their mind. They ask Jesus why the scribes taught that the coming of Elijah would precede the coming of the Messiah. And so Jesus answers and says, "Well, it's true that Elijah must first come, but that it's also true that he's already come. He's already arrived, and has been rejected." He said they've done whatever they wanted to with him. In Matthew 17, verses 12 through 13, Matthew's account of this, he adds that they understand that Jesus is talking about John the Baptist. All right, so now Peter, James, and John. Jesus, Peter, James, and John. They arrive down at the bottom of the mountain, and they find the rest of the disciples that are engaged in basically a heated discussion. with some scribes, and they are surrounded by a multitude of people. And so when this multitude sees Jesus, they immediately come running up to him to greet him. And then Jesus asks the scribes, what have they been discussing with the disciples? So we come down to verse 17, and this is they respond to Jesus' question. It says, and one of the multitude answered and said, Master, I have brought unto thee my son, which hath a dumb spirit. And wheresoever he taketh him, he teareth him, and he foameth, and he gnasheth with his teeth, and pineth away. And I spake to thy disciples that they should cast him out, but they could not. All right, so the first line, it says, and one of the multitude answered and said, Master, have I brought unto thee my son, which hath a dumb spirit. This man who's apparently has been the center of the discussion. He steps forward, and he's a father, he has a son, and this son has a dumb spirit. Dumb meaning that he can't speak. And apparently the fact that the boy has this evil spirit in him, it is preventing him from speaking. And then he adds and says, and wheresoever he taketh him, he teareth him, and foameth, and gnasheth with his teeth, and pineth away. All right, so when it says wheresoever he taketh, the word taketh means basically it seizes him. Like, I guess things could be normal, then all of a sudden it hits him, and then he goes into these convulsions. The word teareth there, it says he teareth him. The word teareth means to throw down in convulsions. So it would just seize him, and he would just, I guess, fall to the ground and just go into convulsions. And then it says, and he foameth and gnasheth with his teeth. So the young man is foaming at the mouth. He's grinding his teeth. And then the word pineth away, or the Greek word that's translated pineth away, means to dry up or withers. In fact, some translations of the Bible translate that as, and he becomes rigid. So he goes into these convulsions, and then I guess at the end of it, he just seizes up and just becomes stiff as a board. And we'll find out later in verse 22 that sometimes when he goes into these seizures, he would fall into a fire, or he might fall into water, places where he might come to harm. And so some commentators believe this boy had epilepsy. But here later in this, in verse 25, it says Jesus rebuked the foul spirit. So apparently a spirit was the root cause of what he was going through. And apparently it was manifesting itself with epileptic type of symptoms here. Now that doesn't mean that when you come across somebody today that has epilepsy, that doesn't mean that they have an evil spirit. I mean, not necessarily. Could be, maybe. I mean, we don't know. We still don't understand everything that goes on in the spirit world. But in this particular case, it was an evil spirit that was causing this boy to have these convulsions, and that looked very much like an epileptic seizure. All right. Then he says, and I spake to thy disciples that they should cast him out, and they could not. See, the father had arrived with his son looking for Jesus. The disciples were there, but Jesus wasn't there. That's because Jesus was up on the mountain being transfigured. But the disciples, no doubt, because Jesus had already given them the authority back in Mark chapter 6, verse 7, he'd given them the authority to cast out demonic spirits, as well as heal people from sicknesses. And so, no doubt, they thought, well, we can handle this. Jesus is busy. He's given us the authority. We can handle this. But when they tried it, they were not able to do it. All right, so verse 19 says, He answereth him and saith, O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I suffer you? And then he says, bring him to me. All right, so in Matthew, actually Matthew and Luke, both their accounts of this, they give us a more complete version of what Jesus said. And he says, O faithless and perverse generation. And the word perverse means to go and to turn away from the right path, which if you are being faithless, then you are turning away from the right path. You are not following the path of faith. But Jesus seems to be frustrated at different levels here. The Greek word for generation, when he says, "O faithless generation," we typically think of it as a span of time of like today's generation, those that were born or lived within a certain span of time. But it can also, in the Greek, it can also refer to a family line. We think of it this way, but it also can refer to everybody in a family line according to a bloodline. And so it may very well be Jesus is saying to you, faithless generation, referring to Israel, his people who should have had faith, should have been, welcomed him with open arms, but instead they respond to Jesus with unbelief. And so he may be referring to Israel as a whole, or the Jews as a whole, that they are being perverse by not greeting him with faith. He may also be doing it, expressing his frustration with the scribes, because the scribes were they were, King James is questioning, but it basically means a discussion. They were debating, I guess, with the disciples, and it's possible they may have been gloating because they had been unsuccessful in casting this boy out, and so they were like, "Aha, you see, this Jesus stuff doesn't work." And then he was probably frustrated with the disciples themselves, who did not apparently have enough faith to cast out this evil spirit. And we'll find out later that Jesus says it very distinctly, that he says it's your lack of faith that's the reason you couldn't cast the spirit out. All right, and then Jesus, despite all this frustration, despite his looking at this faithless generation, and that they, all these people with no faith, he still has enough compassion. He tells the Father, he says, "Bring him to me. Bring him, even though my disciples couldn't handle it, bring him to me. I'll take care of it." So verse 20 says, "And they brought him unto him, and when he saw him, straightway the spirit tare him, and he fell on the ground and wallowed foaming." So the boy was brought to Jesus, but as soon as he saw Jesus, the demonic spirit immediately set him into violent convulsions. Now this demonic spirit most certainly recognized who Jesus was, as did other demonic spirits that Jesus cast out. Luke 4:41 says, "And the devils also came out of many, crying out and saying, Thou art the Christ, the Son of God. And he rebuked them, suffering them not to speak, for they knew that he was the Christ." And then Mark 1:34 says, "And he healed many that were sick of diverse diseases, and cast out many devils, and suffered not the devils to speak, because they knew him." So they, no doubt, this demonic spirit recognized who Jesus was, and it may be that he knew that that's Jesus, he's going to cast me out, and so he may have dug in his heels thinking, well, I'm not going to go peacefully, or I'm not going to go easy. I'm going to hang on as best as I can. And so he throws this young man into convulsions again. Well, it says the Spirit tear him, which is, I think, basically the same Greek word as we saw earlier when it said he tore him. He teareth him. It throws him into convulsions. And this may have been some of the most violent convulsions that this boy had ever experienced. So he's resisting. This demonic spirit apparently is resisting in a futile effort to resist Jesus' authority. And then verse 21, it says, and he asked his father, how long is it ago since this came unto him? And he said, of a child. And it's interesting because, Mark's gospel tends to be a more concise gospel. He just says, all right, this happened, this happened, this happened. It doesn't always give us details. Here, in this particular case, Mark is actually giving us more details. And that seems to be in line with Mark's M.O., I guess you could say, because he wants to present Jesus as a human being, emphasizing his human qualities. And here, Jesus is interacting with the Father. Because in Matthew and Luke, they just say, after he finds out that the disciples couldn't cast him out, then Jesus cast him out, and it just says he did it and goes on. But here, Mark is actually giving us the details of a conversation between Jesus and the Father. And so he asked the Father, how long has this been going on with this son of yours? And so he says, of a child. And so, assuming that this young man is, well, that kind of implies that he's no longer a child as far as a young child, that now he's probably at least a teenager, possibly older, possibly an adult. And so if that's the case, then this has been this son has been going through this for years. He has been afflicted for a long time. Then verse 22 says, and oft times it hath cast him into the fire and into the waters to destroy him. But if thou canst do anything, have compassion on us and help us. All right. So now the Father, I guess, not only is he letting Jesus know it's been a long time, but now he's kind of giving some more information of maybe the severity of how much his son has suffered. Because he says, and oft times it hath cast him into the fire and into the waters to destroy him. So sometimes when he goes into convulsions, he might fall into the fire that's been made there for either just for heat or for cooking or whatever. He falls into the fire sometimes. And sometimes it's into water. In whatever case, if they're by a riverside or if it's a container of water, a basin or something in the house or something, he's fallen into the water, making it possible. He could either get burned or else get drowned. But then he says to destroy him. In other words, the Father he's saying this demonic spirit is trying to kill my son, because sometimes he throws him to a fire, sometimes he throws him into water, and he's either trying to burn him or he's trying to drown him. He says he has been trying to bring harm to my son, and even to the point of killing him. But then he says, but if thou canst do anything, have compassion on us and help us. So you got to remember, this man has brought his son to the disciples, and they acted like they could do something and they couldn't. And so now he may be questioning, okay, now Jesus, now you're here. Maybe you can do something, maybe you can't. So he says, if thou canst do anything. In other words, if you could, he's asking Jesus, please just do whatever you can. If you can help us, great. If not, then I don't know what I'm going to do. But he says, if thou if thou canst do anything. And then he says, have compassion on us and help us. He also seems to be questioning perhaps Jesus' willingness, because on one hand, Jesus might or he might not be able to do this. And even if he can, he might or he might not be willing to do it. And so he's saying, please have compassion. When you say, oh, have compassion, you're trying to compel that person. It's a question of whether or not they are actually going to do it. He says, have compassion on us and help us. Now in Hebrews 11, and I forget which verse, but it says, those that come to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those that diligently seek him. And basically that verse boils down to, you got to believe that he is God, that he can do whatever he's promised he would do, and then that he is a rewarder. In other words, he is willing to do those that diligently seek him, to listen and help those that diligently seek him. And so we see the doubt on this father. He's brought his son to Jesus, quite likely out of desperation, but there's a glimmer of hope there that maybe Jesus has done so many. I've heard so many great things Jesus has done. Maybe he can do this, but he's obviously doubting, because he says, if you can do anything, and then he says, please have compassion. Thinking, if you can do something, then don't just ignore this need. Please have compassion on us and help us. But now listen to how Jesus responds. And Jesus said unto him, if thou canst believe, all things are possible to him that believeth. And straightway the father of the child cried out and said with tears, Lord, I believe, help thou mine unbelief. Okay, the father has just said, if thou canst do anything, then have compassion. But then Jesus said, if thou canst believe. He's saying, look, it's not dependent on whether or not I can or can't do something, or whether or not I'm willing to do it. He says, if it's going to be dependent on whether or not you can believe, because he's turned it back on the man. That he says, look, I can do it, and I'm willing to do it. He says, the question is, do you believe that I can do it? And he says, all things are possible to him that believeth. See, and this is where I pray that I don't misrepresent faith. It's because faith is a powerful thing, and it can determine whether or not God acts on our behalf. But we can't put faith in our faith. Some people will, particularly I think in the Pentecostal things, they think, oh, well, if I can just believe the impossible, and they start trying to put their faith in believing in this, that, and the other things that it's not even in God's will or God's never promised. Faith is believing what God has said, essentially. But faith, we don't put faith in our faith. We put faith in the God who we have faith in. That sounds a little circular reasoning there, but because faith pleases God, and unbelief gives God no reason to act on our behalf. In Matthew 11, verse 58, this is Jesus. He's returned to Nazareth, and they are offended in him. They don't believe in him. And it says, and he did not many mighty works there because of their unbelief. And I've tried to, ponder how to explain this, and I'm not 100% sure that I understand it, but the best I can come up with, if we get anything from God, Jesus Christ is our conduit through which we get anything from God. But faith is the key that unlocks that door to allow those blessings to come to us. If we don't believe, then that door remains locked. But if when we do believe, that the door becomes unlocked and those blessings can flow. Then Mark 11:23, Jesus said, "For verily I say unto you that Whosoever shall say unto this mountain, Be thou removed, and be cast into the sea, and shall not doubt in his heart, he shall believe, but shall believe that those things which he saith shall come to pass, he shall have whatsoever he saith. But that's not a blank check that we can get anything that we want. 1 John 5, verses 14, 15. And this is the confidence that we have in him, that is in God, that if we ask anything according to his will, he heareth us. And of course, hearing, he means hearing with the attitude of welcoming and that I am ready to do what you would ask. But it says he heareth us, and if we know that he hear us, whatsoever we ask, we know that we have the petitions that we desired of him. And so, if we are trusting him, well, John says, we have that confidence that if it's something according to God's will, then of course God is going to answer that prayer. And then Hebrews 11, verse 6, it says, but without faith it is impossible to please him. For he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. So it's, unless we have faith, then we're not going to please God. It pleases God for us to trust him, to believe in him, that he can do whatever we ask. And so when we don't believe him, then we have that frustration that Jesus had, that when he says, "Oh, faithless and perverse generation," says, how long am I going to have to deal with you? All right, so, but Jesus said that to the man. He said, if you can believe, he said, all things are possible to those that believe. And then the Father, he immediately recognizes how much doubt he has in his heart. He believes to a certain extent. He wants to believe, but he understands that there's doubt there. And so it says, straightway the father of the child cried out and said with tears. He's saying it with tears because he desperately wants to see his son healed of this, have this demonic spirit cast out, and heal his son of all this affliction that he's been having to deal with. And so he says it with tears because he's desperate. But he says, Lord, I believe. But he says, help thou mine unbelief. Now, that sounds contradictory, but every one of us that has faith in God understands that, because we know up here that God, that every word in this book is true. We understand that. But then when it comes down to where the rubber meets the road, down here in our heart, we still wonder, is God going to do this? Will he do this? Even to the extent of sometimes in our fallen nature, we look at situations we know, humanly speaking, it's impossible for something to happen, for this problem to get solved, and so we wonder, can even God do this? But we have to believe that there's nothing impossible to God. And because there's nothing impossible with God, that's why Jesus can say, if thou canst believe, all things are possible to him that believeth. It's not our faith that generates the power. It's the fact that we are listening or looking to a God who can do anything, and we let him, we're trusting that he will do it. And because we believe, that's when it prompts him to act and move in our behalf. All right, so the man is crying out, Lord, help mine unbelief. Help me to get me over the finish line, so to speak, as far as having the faith. And so verse 25 says, when Jesus saw that the people came running together, he rebuked the foul spirit, saying unto him, Thou dumb and deaf spirit, I charge thee, come out of him and enter no more into him. So Jesus sees the crowds gathering, and I guess he decides, before this crowd gets any bigger, I'm going to go ahead and take care of the situation. So he he commands the foul spirit to leave the young man and never come back. And so verse 26, and the spirit cried and rent him sore and came out of him, and he was as one dead, insomuch that many said, he is dead. But Jesus took him by the hand, lifted him up, and he rose. So apparently his evil spirit, it had dug in its heels. It did not want to leave. It apparently tried to resist, but Jesus Christ's authority was too powerful. He could not ultimately resist him, but he didn't go. He didn't leave quietly, and so it says the spirit cried and rent him sore. It just went into, this may have been the most severe convulsions that the boy had ever experienced. And as the demonic spirit left, he cried out. And then once it was gone, the boy apparently was exhausted to where he was just laying, in what appeared to be in a lifeless state. And so some of the onlookers must have concluded, or they did conclude, well, the boy must be dead. What that evil spirit put him through, he's got to be dead. But Jesus takes him by the hand, helps him up, and the boy's okay. All right, so verse 28 says, and when he was coming to the house, his disciples asked him privately, why could not we cast him out? And he said unto them, this kind can come forth by nothing but by prayer and fasting. So once Jesus and his disciples get into a private place inside of a house, the crowd's outside behind them, and they want to know, why could we not cast him out? He says, you gave us, the authority to cast out the demonic spirits, back when they were going out 2 by 2. He says, and they had been successful in casting out spirits. But so they can't understand why were we not able to do in this particular case? Why could we not cast him out? And so he said unto them, this kind can come forth by nothing but by prayer and fasting. Now Mark kind of keeps, he abbreviates what Jesus said. Mark, in Matthew, verses 17 through 20, Matthew chapter 17, verses 19 through 21. It says, then the disciples came to Jesus apart and said, why could not we cast him out? And Jesus said unto them, because of your unbelief. For verily I say unto you, if you have faith as a grain of mustard seed, you shall say unto this mountain, remove hence to yonder place, and it shall remove, and nothing shall be impossible to you. Howbeit this kind goeth not out by prayer and fasting. So there's a twofold reason here. They both have to do with faith. The first part that Matthew records, he says it's because of your unbelief. He makes it very clear. It's because you disciples did not have enough faith. And it quite likely was they did not have the faith in the right thing. Then he says, howbeit this kind goeth not out but by prayer and fasting. Prayer and fasting is a way, a method, or it's a way of adding to your faith, of focusing your faith. You go to God in prayer and asking him to give you more faith, or asking. Quite likely the disciples were dependent. Their faith was in the fact that they had done this before. That Jesus had given them the authority, and so they probably thought, oh yeah, we can do this. And that's not how you approach this. This is something. He says, your unbelief, you did not believe, you didn't trust in the power that's going to do this. It was God and not yourself. And when you pray and you fast, you are focusing yourself on the Lord, and you're saying, Lord, I know I can't do it. Lord, you do it. And so fasting and prayer demonstrate our dependence on God. And so the fact that the disciples had trusted their authority that had been given to them, it may be the reason why when they came back, when he'd sent them out two by two, and they came back rejoicing, saying, hey, the spirits are subject to us, we just tell them to come on out, and they have to come out. And Jesus tells them, says, don't rejoice because the spirits are subject to you. In other words, don't glory in that, the fact that you've been given the authority. He says, but rejoice because your name is written in the Lamb's Book of Life. Or your name is written in heaven. That's Luke 10:20. And so the disciples may have been taken up thinking, oh yeah, we can do this, thinking it depended on them. But instead they had their unbelief because they were not believing that God would do it. And that probably explains why Jesus was able to do it without prayer and fasting. He says, this kind cometh out but by nothing but by prayer and fasting. He didn't have to pray and fast. And he was able to say, come on out of him, you foul spirit. The disciples, however, with their unbelief, they would have had to have prayed and fasted in order to build up their faith, I guess you could say, or to appeal to God to strengthen their faith, which is in effect is what the father said. He said, Lord, I believe, but help thou mine unbelief. We all need help in our faith, and the only place that faith comes from, Ephesians 2, and I forget the verse, but he says, faith cometh by hearing, and no, that's not the verse. Let me find it real quick. Chapter 2. For by grace are you saved through faith, and not of yourselves. He says it is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. The gift of God, which commentators debate on whether or not the gift of God is the salvation, or the grace, or the faith, or the whole thing, but or all of it is the gift of God, which I would have no problem with that. But the faith comes from God. He's the one that gives us the faith. And so I think that's why Jesus said this kind can come forth by nothing but by prayer and fasting. You've got to depend on God to give you the faith to be able to do what he wants you to do. And that's why the disciples were unable to cast out this evil spirit. All right, so we'll pick up in Mark chapter 10 next week.